It had been 11 days since I'd heard from any of my children. 11 days isn't long, I know. People get busy. Life moves fast, especially when you have jobs and kids of your own, and everything pulling at you in every direction. I understood that. I'd told myself that many times over the years. But there was something different about this particular silence, and somewhere underneath the rationalizations, I already knew what it was. I just wasn't ready to say it plainly yet. There was an envelope on the counter that morning, cream-colored, business-sized, return address from a law office I didn't recognize. I'd set it aside 2 days earlier when it arrived, meaning to open it when I was in the right frame of mind. I'm not sure what I thought the right frame of mind would look like. I left it there and made the coffee. My name is Eleanor. I'm 71 years old, and I lived in a mid-sized city in Ohio, in the same house where I raised 3 children over the course of 30-some years. My husband, Bernard, passed away 4 years ago after a long illness. We were married 43 years. He was a methodical man, quiet. The kind of person who read the terms before signing anything and kept every receipt in a labeled folder. I used to tease him about those folders. After he was gone, I missed them. Some people mistake silence for permission. I've thought about that line a great deal in the months since everything changed. What I mean is, when I stopped speaking up about what was happening, my children took that as agreement. They took my patience for endorsement. And I let them for a long time because the alternative felt unbearable. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's where this ends up. Let me tell you where it began. It started, I think, the way most slow erosions start gradually, and with something that seemed reasonable at the time. My son, Marcus, is 44 years old. He and his wife, Diane, live about 40 minutes from where I used to live. They have 2 children, teenagers now, and Marcus works in commercial real estate. He'd been having a difficult year. A deal fell through, some financial pressure, and about 6 months after Bernard died, he called me on a Sunday afternoon and asked if I could help them cover a gap. Just temporarily, he said. They were waiting on a commission payment. It would only be a few weeks. I said yes. Of course, I said yes. He was my son. The amount was $8,000. I didn't think much of it at the time. I had the savings. Bernard had been careful with our money for decades, and we had a reasonable nest egg. $8,000 felt manageable. The weeks passed. The commission came through, Marcus said, but the repayment didn't come. I told myself I'd bring it up when the moment felt right. It never did. My daughter, Sandra, is 41. She lives farther away North Carolina and works as a freelance graphic designer. She's always been the creative one, a little scattered with money, a little optimistic about timelines. About a year after Marcus's loan, Sandra called about a situation with her apartment lease. Her landlord had raised the rent significantly, and she needed first and last month's deposits for a new place while still on the hook for the old one. Could I help bridge the gap? The amount was $6,500. I said yes. Then there's my youngest, Daniel. He's 38. Daniel is charming in a way that has always made it easier for him to ask for things. He moves through the world with a kind of easy confidence, and you want to help him because he makes the asking feel natural, almost collaborative. He asked me twice in that first year alone. Once for car repairs, once for something related to a business idea that he described at length, but that I never fully understood. Those 2 requests together, about $14,000. By the end of the second year after Bernard died, I had quietly given away just over $60,000. By the end of the third year, the number was closer to $140,000. And by the time I found myself standing at that kitchen counter on that grey Tuesday morning in October, watching my phone not ring, the total was somewhere in the neighborhood of $250,000. I want to be clear. I made those choices. I signed those transfers. Nobody held a gun to my head. But I also want to be honest about how it happened, because it didn't happen all at once. It happened the way a tide comes in slowly, then all at once, until you look down and realize the water is at your waist. There's a moment I keep returning to, one that sits somewhere around year 2 of all this. I was visiting Marcus and Diane for a birthday dinner, one of the grandchildren, I think it was Emily, turning 14. I'd driven over with a gift I'd spent time picking out and brought a pie from the bakery Bernard and I used to go to on Saturdays. I remember the smell of it in the car, the warmth of the box on the seat beside me. Dinner was pleasant enough. The kids were loud in the way teenagers are loud, not unkind, just elsewhere. But at some point during dessert, Marcus made a comment. He was talking to Diane, not to me directly, and I'm not sure he realized I could hear him clearly from where I was sitting. He said, "We should probably figure out what she's planning to do with the house eventually." Just like that, matter of fact. The way you'd mention an item on a to-do list. Diane nodded. She said, yeah. Neither of them looked at me. I cut another slice of pie and didn't say anything. And that, I think, was the first moment I understood. Something had shifted, not just in what they expected, but in how they saw me. Not quite as a person making choices, but as an estate waiting to be settled. At the time, I told myself I'd misunderstood, that it was an offhand remark. That family conversations wander into practical territory, and it doesn't have to mean anything. Later, I realized that moment mattered more than I wanted to admit. The financial planner's name was Patricia Holt. She had an office on the 4th floor of a building downtown, with a window that looked out over the river. I'd been seeing her on and off for a few years, originally at Bernard's suggestion, and she had a way of presenting information without editorializing that I appreciated. I came in for a routine review in March. This would have been about 8 months before that quiet Tuesday morning. Patricia spread some documents across the desk, walked me through the projections, my savings rate, my withdrawal patterns, my current holdings against a baseline longevity estimate. She was calm about it, methodical, which made it land harder, somehow, than if she'd been alarmed. She said, "Eleanor, at the current rate of outflow, you'll run short of liquid assets within 6 to 8 years. That's without any unexpected medical costs, which at 71 we need to factor in." I looked at the documents, she said. "The transfers to your children account for the majority of the variance from your original plan. I want to make sure you understand what continuing that pattern means for your own security." I said, "I understand." She looked at me for a moment over her glasses. She said, "Do you want to talk through how to change the pattern?" I said, I did. And then I went home and sat in Bernard's chair in the living room for a long time. That was the beginning of the end, in a way. Not the dramatic end that came later, but the moment where I stopped managing the situation and started seeing it clearly. I went home that afternoon and sat in Bernard's chair. And for the first time in a long while, I thought about those folders he kept. Labeled, alphabetized, every document in its place. I had teased him about them for 40 years. But sitting there, I found myself wondering if one of them might have something in it I'd overlooked. Something about the house. I told myself I'd look later. I did look, but not until much later, and not for the reason I originally thought. I told Marcus first. He called in early April about something he wanted to know if I'd consider co-signing on a business loan he was taking out. A commercial property investment. The numbers were significant. I listened to the whole pitch, which took about 20 minutes, and then I said no. There was a pause. He said, "What do you mean, no?" I said I'd been reviewing my finances, and I wasn't in a position to take on any additional financial obligations or make any additional large transfers. I said I wanted to be straightforward with him rather than make excuses. He said, "Mum, this is a real opportunity. We're talking about long-term return here." I said I understood, and my answer was still no. He went quiet again. Then he said, I just think you could be more supportive. I said, Marcus, I've transferred a substantial amount of money to you over the past 3 years. I think I've been quite supportive. He hung up not long after that, not angrily, just ended the call. That's when everything changed. Not loudly, just quietly, like a door pulled shut. Sandra's reaction came by text, which surprised me, because Sandra and I had always been close, or I had believed we were. It was a Sunday. I remember because I'd been in the garden that morning, the part along the back fence where Bernard had planted climbing roses the first summer we lived there. I was deadheading the spent blooms, which is a task that requires your hands but not much of your mind, and my phone was in my pocket. I felt it vibrate once, twice, then a third time in quick succession. I pulled off my garden gloves and read the first few lines, standing there in the dirt. Morning light, still low over the fence, the smell of cut stems and damp soil on my hands. Sandra had written a long message, and I mean long, the kind that takes several scrolls about how she'd always felt unsupported, how I'd favored Marcus growing up, how she'd done everything she could to maintain a relationship with me despite how difficult I could be. I read it twice, still standing there. A rose petal fell off a spent bloom onto the toe of my garden shoe, and I watched it for a moment before I looked back at the screen. There was almost nothing in it I recognized as our actual history. But I noticed what wasn't in it. There was no mention of the money, no acknowledgement of any of it. It was as if the previous 3 years of financial transfers had simply been erased from her version of events, and now she was free to be aggrieved about other things. I pulled the glove back on and went back to the roses. I wrote back one sentence when I went inside. I love you, Sandra, and I'm sorry you're hurting. She didn't respond. Daniel called 2 weeks later. He was more direct. He said he'd heard from Marcus and Sandra that I'd shut everyone out, and he wanted to know what was going on with me. He said he was worried. He said the whole family was worried. I said, Daniel, I've made some decisions about my finances that your brother and sister are upset about. That's the short version. He said, well, what are we supposed to do? We rely on you. And there it was, not said with cruelty, exactly. Just honestly, plainly, as if relying on a 71-year-old widow for money was simply a fact of the world, something as natural as the weather. I said, I think that's something you'll need to figure out. He didn't call again for quite a while. The silence that followed was not nothing. I want to be honest about that. There were days in May and June that were genuinely hard. I'd find myself reaching for my phone to call Sandra and then setting it back down. I'd see something, a news story, a funny sign in a shop window, a recipe I thought one of the grandchildren might like, and the reflex to share it would rise up. And then there was nowhere to send it. I'm not a person who cries easily. Bernard used to say I had what he called a long fuse, meaning it took a great deal to get a reaction out of me in either direction. He meant it as a compliment, mostly. But that spring, I cried more than I had since the weeks after he died, not because my children were angry at me, that I could manage, because I was beginning to understand that I had spent 3 years trying to buy my way back into a family I already belonged to, and it hadn't worked. And looking back, I could see that it was never going to work, because the thing I was trying to purchase, genuine want for my presence, genuine interest in my life, was never on the table. I had been purchasing tolerance, and when I stopped purchasing it, the tolerance ended. That's a hard thing to see clearly. Quiet assumptions, I've learned, can be more dangerous than open demands. It was sometime in June that I finally opened Bernard's folders. The filing cabinet was in the spare bedroom, and I'd walked past it 100 times without stopping. That afternoon I stopped. I went through them, methodically, insurance documents, mortgage records, property deeds. And I found something I hadn't thought about in years. The original deed to the house. and Bernard's estate transfer paperwork from when he died. His name, then mine. Clean and unambiguous. I set the folder on the desk and looked at it for a while. Then I thought about that envelope still sitting on the kitchen counter. The law office return address I hadn't recognized. I went and opened it. It was nothing dramatic. A form letter from a firm that had apparently purchased an old account of Bernard's. A routine notification. It required no action. But standing there in the kitchen reading it, something clicked into place. The documents in Bernard's folders, the deed in my name, the transfers I'd made to my children, all of them fully voluntary, none of them legally binding obligations. I had been behaving as if I owed them something. The law, it turned out, was not confused about this at all. The day I'm thinking of now is a Thursday in July. Hot. The kind of heat that sits on a Midwestern city like a weight, and you move through it slowly, a little reluctantly. I was at the grocery store, the one I'd been going to for 15 years, on the corner about a mile from my house. I was in the produce section, doing what I always do, checking the state of the tomatoes, when I heard a familiar voice in the next aisle. It was Diane, Marcus's wife. She was on the phone, talking to someone, laughing a little, and I heard her say clearly, because the store was not crowded and she was not speaking quietly, "Oh, she'll come around eventually. And if she doesn't, at least there's still the property. That house has to be worth something now." A pause. Then, "Yeah, we just have to be patient." I stood very still with a tomato in my hand. She came around the corner about 30 seconds later and saw me. Her face did something complicated. She said, "Eleanor, hi. I didn't know you shopped here," I said. "I've shopped here for 15 years. She said something about Marcus saying hello and she'd see me soon. And then she moved away quickly toward the other end of the store. I put the tomato back. I didn't finish the shopping. I drove home and sat in the driveway for a while before I went inside. The paperwork already had my name on it. That was the thought that came to me, sitting there. Not their name. Mine, my house, my savings, my life. And yet somewhere along the way, in their minds, it had already been redistributed. I was simply the current occupant of my own existence, holding it in trust until it passed on to the rightful parties. That thought arrived quietly. And then, after a few minutes, it made me very calm. I called Patricia Holt the next morning. I told her I wanted to understand, fully, what my options were regarding my primary residence. She said she could connect me with a real estate attorney she trusted. She did, within the week. The attorney's name was Robert Garland. His office was plain. He had a shelf of binders behind him and a habit of writing things down, even when they didn't seem to need writing down. I liked him immediately. I explained the situation. Not emotionally, factually. The amounts I'd transferred. The estrangement. The conversation I'd overheard. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he set down his pen and said, "Mrs. Eleanor, I want to make sure I understand what you're considering." I said, "I'm considering selling the house and relocating." He said, "Do your children have any legal claim to that property?" I said, "It's my house. It was jointly held with my husband, and I inherited his share upon his death. Their names are not on anything." He said, "Then the answer is no. You can sell it whenever you'd like, to whoever you'd like, for whatever price the market will bear." He paused. Then he added, "Do you want to tell them first?" I thought about that for a moment. I said, "I'll leave them a letter." On the drive home from Robert Garland's office, I thought about Bernard's folders again, about the deed, about how clearly everything had been laid out, documented, organized, and how none of that clarity had ever made its way into my children's understanding of what belonged to whom. Bernard had known. He'd put it all in writing because he believed that clear documentation was a form of kindness. It prevented confusion later, he used to say. It spared people from having to rely on assumptions. He had been right, as he usually was about these things. I just hadn't understood yet what the documentation was protecting. The house sold in September. The market had been favorable. My neighborhood had appreciated significantly over the years, and after some negotiation, we closed at $782,000. I want to describe the closing because it was quieter than I expected. I'd imagined it would feel like something solemn, or final, or frightening. But the room was just a room. A conference table, some papers, a notary. Robert Garland sat beside me. I signed where I was told to sign. The escrow officer explained the disbursement. It was procedural, clean. You can't take what was never yours. I thought that, sitting there, looking at my signature on the transfer documents, the house had always been mine to give or not give. The savings had always been mine to spend or protect. My children had built a future in their heads, using assets that were never theirs to count. And there was nothing I could do about the futures they'd imagined. I could only be responsible for the reality I controlled. The escrow officer slid the final page toward me. I signed it. She initialed below. The notary pressed her stamp. Nobody in that room was confused about who had just made a decision. That realization didn't feel triumphant. It just felt true. I had found a place by then, already, a smaller town. I won't say exactly where, not out of secrecy, really, just because the location doesn't matter as much as the quality of the mornings. And the mornings there are different. The light comes in warmer. There's a bakery 2 blocks from my apartment that opens at 6, and on clear days you can smell the bread from the street. I moved in mid-September, 10 days after the closing. I hired a moving company. I kept what I wanted, some furniture, Bernard's books, the good dishes, a few things from the garden. What I didn't keep I donated or sold. The process was less painful than I'd expected. Objects are just objects. The memory isn't in the thing itself. The letter I left for my children was not long. I drafted it several times over the summer, and each time it got shorter. The final version was 3 paragraphs. I explained that I had sold the house and relocated. I explained that I was well and intended to remain so. I told them I loved them. I told them I had made this decision for myself, not against them. And then I said, and I want to get this right, because I thought about these words carefully. I said, I spent several years believing that what I gave you made me necessary to you. I think we would all have been better served if I had understood sooner that love isn't something you can fund into existence. I mailed it the morning I left. What happened next unfolded over about 3 months. Marcus called first, then Sandra, then Daniel, then Marcus again, in increasing states of agitation. I did not answer the phone. I had changed my number in any case, and they were calling the old one, which rang to voicemail I wasn't checking. They found my new email, eventually, I'm not sure how. Sandra sent a message that alternated between hurt and threat. She said what I'd done was cruel. She said the grandchildren were confused and upset. She said that if I didn't respond, she would have no choice but to consult with a lawyer. I forwarded the email to Robert Garland. His response was brief. Let me know if they contact you again. They did consult a lawyer, as it turned out. There was a brief inquiry into whether the home sale could be contested on grounds that I had been, and this was the word their attorney apparently used, manipulated into the decision. The suggestion seemed to be that someone, somehow, had taken advantage of me. Robert Garland's response to that inquiry was polite and thorough. He documented that I had retained counsel months before the sale, acted independently throughout, and had a long and documented financial history of competent decision-making. The inquiry went nowhere. I received one final certified letter in November. It was from a mediator, suggesting that the family would benefit from a structured conversation. I read it, set it on the kitchen table, and thought about it for 2 days. Then I wrote back and declined. The lawyer looked up from the letter and paused, I'm sure, when he saw that response. Families like mine are supposed to return to the table. That's the assumed arc. But I had sat at that table for 3 years paying for my seat, and I was done. The institutional machinery, the law, the contracts, the title records, does not bend to assumed inheritance. I had come to understand that clearly, and so had they. I've been in my new town for several months now. I have a routine. I wake early. I make coffee. I sit by the window for a while before I do anything else. There's a woman in my building, around my age, who raises orchids and leaves them in the common hallway sometimes. We've had 3 or 4 conversations now that have gone longer than I expected, in the way of conversations that are actually going somewhere. I joined a book group at the library. Small, 8 people. We've read 2 books since I arrived, and argued about both of them with real conviction, which I found unexpectedly energizing. I've thought about Marcus, Sandra, and Daniel. Of course I have. The grandchildren, especially. That's the part that doesn't resolve cleanly, and I won't pretend it does. I hope they understand someday. I hope the children ask questions as they get older, and that the answers they find are honest ones. But I've also come to understand that hoping for that outcome is different from being responsible for engineering it. Some things are not mine to fix. A few weeks ago, I was walking back from the bakery on a Saturday morning with a paper bag of rolls, and I passed the window of a small frame shop on the corner. There was a print in the window, a landscape, soft colours, a field at early light. Nothing dramatic, just a field doing what a field does. I stood there for a moment, looking at it. Bernard would have noticed the quality of the print before the image. He would have said something about the paper, the archival quality, whether it was worth the price. And I would have told him he was missing the point, and he would have smiled. I stood there a little longer than was probably necessary. Then I went home. I said early on that some people mistake silence for permission. And I've been thinking about what I mean when I say that, now, on the other side of it. What I mean is that silence is not the same as agreement. Patience is not the same as permanence. And the fact that someone has come to expect something from you does not create an obligation to provide it forever. I was quiet for a long time. I gave for a long time. And when I stopped, when I finally spoke plainly, the response revealed what had always been true, but never said out loud. They didn't lose an inheritance the day I sold that house. They lost their mother the day they decided I was worth more as a resource than as a person. I made my peace with that. Not easily, not all at once, but I made it. If you've stayed with this story to the end, you've spent some time with something that doesn't have a tidy resolution, just a quiet one. I think quiet is sometimes the more honest ending. If that kind of story resonates with you, the kind where nobody raises their voice but everything still changes, you're welcome to stay. I'll be here.